ready to go.
All right, thank you for the question, Willis. Access to pools and bodies of water has been very limited to communities facing oppression and racism. The disparities, or when we look at drownings and the pool participation use, we can see the same disparities that we see in public health and education. Without really taking into consideration the historical context and racism, socioeconomic circumstances, or even cultural stereotypes. So when we think about cultural stereotypes, maybe you have heard that Black women don't like to swim because we don't want to mess up our hair, or maybe you assume financial limitations, which prevent pool access, swim lessons, competitive swimming, or maybe, I've heard within the Black community that Black people, say they don't want to swim because of trauma passed down from the Middle Passage. But what many people fail to realize is that up until about the late 1800s, non-European people were quite proficient swimmers. And so I want to tell you how we got to this place using the example of the fairground pool in St. Louis, Missouri. But first, I want to outline the historical context of where we were in the US that brought us here. So in 1875, the Civil Rights Act was passed that said that discrimination was illegal in public spaces and accommodations. So basically, the races were integrated and allowed to go to any public spaces, which included public bodies of water and things of that nature. However, the Supreme Court quickly turned that around in 1883 by saying it was unconstitutional. And that was followed in 1896 by Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, which legalized racial segregation in the United States. So at the same time that this was going on in our legal system, a nascent white pool and beach culture was starting to develop in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it really became a thing to the extent that in 1919 in St. Louis, they built this fairground pool, which was something that had never been seen before. And at the time, they said it was the biggest pool possibly in the world. They had sandy beaches, elaborate diving boards, and the pool could reportedly hold up to 10,000 people. So the pool opens, very successful. They reported up to 313,000 people using it over the course of the summer. Well, a few years after opening, a city administrator decided that they wanted to integrate the pool, racially integrate the pool. And so the day that the Blacks arrived to swim, there were a handful of Black people, a handful of white people, but there were hundreds of white protesters standing outside the gates. And they had knives, they had bricks, they had chains. And this became known, and the crowd size grew over the course of the day. So this became known as the Fairground Riots. And the city decided to resegregate the pool after this riot occurred. Well, the next year, the NAACP filed a lawsuit. It was successful. Pool is integrated once again. However, the attendance starts dwindling because obviously the white in this town did not want to go to the same pool as Black people. And so they ended up only having about 10,000 visitors over the course of the summer. And after a couple of summers of this, they decided to permanently close the pool. One other thing to keep into consideration is at the same time they were integrating the races, there was also gender integration. And so when we think about pools, we think about these very close, intimate environments. And so going back to cultural stereotypes, there was a stereotype that Black people were dirty. And so white people didn't want to be in the pool with them. So maybe you've seen images or heard about people pouring bleach in pools. I've read about people pouring acid in the pools. Maybe you've heard that Black people were only allowed to swim on the last day that the pool was open during the season because it was going to be drained and cleaned the next day. So this was one of the prevalent stereotypes. While at the same time, remember, we now are having gender integration, and white men did not want Black men to have access or such close access to white women, particularly, in limited clothing. So all of these things are coming into play around the same time. which takes us to about the mid-1950s. So at this point, a lot of the whites have left these municipal pools. They have started private pool clubs. They're building backyard pools. And so this is across the United States. A lot of these pools start to close. So after the race riots of the 1960s, they did start to rebuild pools in Black communities, but many of these pools were very small. And by small, I mean 20 by 40 feet, 3.5 feet deep. And so this lack of access led to significant consequences in terms of public health. They increased drowning, waterborne illnesses, and other issues. And so today, a lot of those disparities still exist. And that's what we're working on to address here at the Y today. Good enough.